Good morning. This is GE 6101 Readings in Philippine History. Today's topic will be about agrarian reform policies under social, political, economic, and cultural issues in Philippine history. For learning outcomes, at the end of this module, you are expected to identify and understand the agrarian reform policies, analyze issues in the Philippines, such as social, cultural, economic, and political issue using history and recognize numerous current issues in the Philippine society over history. So basically, the topic, which is the agrarian reform policies, would focus on the history of agrarian reform in the Philippines and its significance to Philippine development. But agrarian issues have long existed in the Philippines or in our country, despite the many efforts of the past administrations to address them. You will notice how each of the presidency really took into their administration the agrarian reform policies, that it looks into the programs and policies crafted by past administrations and assesses their contributions and even their shortcomings in terms of achieving effective and genuine agrarian reform policies in the Philippines. So let us differentiate the meaning of land reform and agrarian reform, which are often used interchangeably. So what is land reform? Land reform involves changing or establishing laws, regulations, or customs regarding land ownership. It also refers to the remedies to improve the relation between the tiller and the owner of the land, or employee and employer in a farm. It identifies the rights of the one who owns or uses a particular agricultural land. As I've said, land reform is often used interchangeably with agrarian reform, but agrarian reform is much broader. That agrarian reform covers the restructuring of tenure and the pre and post production support services structures in the agricultural sector. So problems in the distribution or ownership of agricultural lands in the Philippines already exist since the pre-colonial era, or even before the colonization of the Spanish. So as I've said, prior to the Spanish colonial period, there was a system of land ownership was already in place, wherein the datu served as the principal owner of the lands, while the Maharlika and the Timawa were entitled to have some parts of land in certain area. People or Indios categorized as alipin or slave served as the workers of the community. That a majority of yields from the land would go to the datu, but once an alipin was given a piece of land for him or her to own, then they would no longer be considered an alipin. During the Spanish colonial period, the Spanish authorities considered all lands as public domain regardless of cultural customs. So the King of Spain was also at liberty to distribute parcels of lands as rewards to loyal Spanish military and civilians. And due to this, private ownership of land became the trend during the Spanish colonial period. Well, during the First Philippine Republic, when the First Philippine Republic was established in 1899, General Emilio Aguinaldo declared in the Malolos Constitution his intention to confiscate large estates, especially the so-called the friar lands. We know that during the Spanish colonial period, partly or generally the friars were also governing the Philippines in some ways. That large estates were also owned by Spanish priests during that time. So, but Republic was short-lived. Aguinaldo's plan was never implemented. Now, during the American period, or when the Americans took over the Philippines from Spain, a large percentage of the country's land was held by the American colonial government, about 93%. And so the Governor General then, William Howard Taft, he wanted to have a policy that would allow a good portion of the land to be sold off to American investors. And so the United Congress set a limit of 16 hectares to be owned by American individuals and 1,024 hectares by American corporations through the 1902 Land Act, or the Philippine Bill of 1902. Also, there is this called the Land Registration Act of 1902 that provided a comprehensive registrations of land title under the torrent system. So the torrent system, which was instituted by the Americans for the registration of land, did not also solve the problem completely. Either people were not aware of the law, or if they know the law, then they could not pay the survey costs and other fees required in applying for a torrents title. Which, if you will be hearing your grandparents or your parents about this, I think this is still somehow a problem, because really it costs a lot when one would transfer a land title. But such policies by the Americans, well, as I've said, they did not even solve the problem. And so throughout the American colonial period, there are also other important legislation, such as the Public Land Act of 1903, which introduced the homestead system in the Philippines, like the Tenancy Act of 1933, which regulated relationships between landowners and tenants of rice 50-50 sharing and sugarcane lands, which you will find out what would be what is the sharing up to this time. Now, during the Japanese occupation, the Hukbalahap controlled the whole areas of Central Luzon. Landlords who supported the Japanese lost their lands to the farm owners, while those who supported the Hukbalahap earned fixed rentals in favor of the tenants or the renters. Unfortunately, the end of war also signaled the end of gains acquired by the peasants. So, upon the arrival of the Japanese in the Philippines in 1942, peasants and workers organizations grew in strength. Many peasants took up arms and identified themselves with the anti-Japanese group, the Hukbalahap, or Buo ng Bayan Laban sa Hapon. Now, in the new republic, after the establishment of the Philippine independence in 1946, the problems of land tenure remained. Which you would agree that you've heard in the news up to this time that distribution of the land is still ongoing. Actually, that's the target of the Duterte administration, to have a zero backlog. And now going back, again, the problem became worse in certain areas, and Congress of the Philippines revised the tenancy law. That there were actually several presidents that really took it to themselves, or took it to their administrations, some tenancy laws. Okay, so as enacted several laws, like Act number 34, which established a 70-30 sharing arrangement and regular sharing, regulating shared tenancy contracts. And then Republic Act number 55 provided for a more effective safeguard against arbitrary adjustment of tenants. And during the presidency of LTJ Aquino, there's this executive order number 355, which is called the replaced the National Land Settlement Administration with Land Settlement Development Corporation, which is LASEDECO, which takes over the responsibilities of the Agricultural Machinery Equipment Corporation and the Rice and Corn Production Administration. And yeah, there are several laws, but in 1954, they abolished the LASEDECO and replaced with the NARA, or the National Resettlement and Rehabilitation Administration, to resettle residents and landless farmers. So it was particularly aimed at rebel returnees, providing home lots and farmlands in Palawan and Mindanao. Also, there's again the Agricultural Tenancy Act of 1954, governing the relationship between landowners and tenant farmers, again by organizing the shared tenancy and leasehold system. Also, there is this Land Reform Act of 1955, which created the Land Tenure Administration, or the LTA, which was responsible for the acquisition and distribution of the large tenanted rice and corn lands over 200 hectares for individuals and 600 hectares for corporations. Also, there's also this Republic Act number 821, which was the creation of Agricultural Credit Cooperative Financing Administration, which provided small farmers and shared tenant loans with low interest rates of 6 to 8%. And during the term of Carlos Garcia, there was no law enacted, but continued only the program that of Ramon Magsaysay. And then under President Estado Macapagal, also from 1961 to 65, there were laws enacted, including the Agricultural Land Reform Code. And they say that this RA was one of the best that liberated Filipino farmers from the bondage of tenancy or tenure or contract. And during the time of Marcos, and there were also several laws enacted, but on September 21, 1972, there was this proclamation 1081, which ushered the period of the new society 5 days after the proclamation of the martial law. The entire country was proclaimed a land reform area, and simultaneously the Agrarian Reform Program was decreed. And under Marcos' administration, he enacted laws such as the Code of Agrarian Reform, which created the Department of Agrarian Reform and Agrarian Reform Special Account Fund. Presidential Decree number 2 declared the country under Land Reform Program, and Presidential Decree number 27, which restricted the land reform scope to tenanted rice and corn lands and set the retention limit at 7 hectares. But they say that the matters became worse during the authoritarian rule of Marcos. And Marcos was tagged basically as a dominant local landlord. The martial law period basically was the time of land grabbing and awarding of concessions to the Marcos cronies, including his family, including some of the personalities who were loyal to him. And there were huge corruption during the time of Marcos. Such corruption heightened the call for the genuine agrarian reform program. So when the downfall of the Marcos administration, there were basically demands for agrarian reform. The damage was very huge. That it was quite basically a challenge. No, when Corazon Aquino became president, the public had high hopes that efforts would really be facilitated to come up with a genuine historic agrarian reform program. That the Aquino administration was able to pass the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, in 1988, June 15, 1988, which was actually heralded as the single most important piece of government legislation. That the CARP, or the CAR, establishes the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, known as the result of the congressional haggling between the lawmakers, the landowners, and the advocates of land reform. And during that time, with a fresh start following the bad experience, or the dark years of martial law, the EDSA power, which was vested to the Aquino administration, they had the opportunity they tried to play field and turn it upside again. And then there was this legislative power conferred to President Corazon Aquino. Well, of course, we know that she was put into power through revolutionary government. It was vested upon her to empower her to quickly implement radical agrarian reform program, which under Corazon Aquino's administration started out by supporting the, well, of course, the farmers, and the middle class and the elite supported the Corazon Aquino administration, because the elite that enjoy the harvest of capitalism would never allow a genuine law by the Aquino administration. And so this spelled out the fate of the agrarian reform in the Philippines, that they drafted very fastly. And currently, no, in 2018, because the CARP, which was started by Corazon Aquino, was continued on by the presidency or the administration of Fidel V. Ramos, by the Estrada administration, and even by the Gloria Macapagal Arroyo administration, which basically the birth of the CARPER, the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program extension with reforms. This is actually a mandatory law that extends the deadline of distributing agricultural lands to farmers for some years. That it was also backed up by additional budget to continue, and that's why the program of the distribution of lands continued even after 2014, upon the extension of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo's administration. No? And currently, the agrarian reform issues continuously is basically the issue, which is the implementation of a genuine agrarian reform program, is actually still a dream of the Filipino farmers. And let's see what's still the update up to this time.